Alan.
Hi.
Sarah. Very good.
How are you?
Thank you for joining us.
I'm very pleased to be with you.
And Alan, I haven't seen you for ages.
Who's the guy in the middle?
Well, Harry, I have to be able to turn my camera on. Ah, I lost it. Ridiculous. Why can't I?
So today, or tonight for us here in Jerusalem area, we have with us Sarah Bernstein, Dr. Sarah Bernstein, the Executive Director of the Rossing Center for Education and Dialogue. Sarah's going to talk about healing hatred, a personal journey, and I'm just going to read a little part of her biography. Dr. Sarah Bernstein has served as the Executive Director of the Rossing Center for Education and Dialogue since 2013. Born and raised in the UK, she worked for several years in Israel as a lawyer and mediator. For over 2 decades, she has been active in the field of peace building and coexistence work, specializing in interreligious dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians. In 2011, Sarah was awarded her Ph.D. in Peace and Reconciliation Studies by Coventry University in England. Her thesis was entitled Narratives of Belonging, Life Stories of Jewish Israeli Women in Jerusalem. Sarah was a member of the Alliance for Peacebuilding Global Advisory Council on Effective Interreligious Peacebuilding Evaluation, and based on her development of a distinctive approach to interreligious dialogue, was a founding board member of the International Association of Spiritual Care. She has lectured and presented extensively in Israel, North America, Europe, South Africa, and Japan. So with that introduction, I'll say good evening to Sarah and take it away.
Great. Good evening. Good evening. Good morning. Good afternoon. Somebody in Japan. Good middle of the night. I don't know what time it is with you, but anyway, whatever time of day or night, I'm delighted to be with you here in this virtual room. Thank you to Hanan, to Rabbi Schlesinger, for inviting me to be here with you. These are obviously, as Alan, well, as is blatantly obvious, these are challenging times for all of us, both in the health sphere, in the political realm, democracy, so many challenges we're dealing with. This evening, I want to talk about 3 main things. I'm going to describe my personal journey, particularly over the last 20 years, but not only. I'll look at some of the work we're doing at the Rossing Center, and I'll even finish up with a brief piece of theology for you. So 20 years ago, the Peace Council, which is a group of very eminent religious leaders from around the world, came to visit Israel. Their 5-day visit happened to fall over Yom HaShoah, over Holocaust Remembrance Day. And so as part of their program, we took them to a memorial service. And after the service, the renowned Cambodian Buddhist monk, Maha Ghosananda, you may recall his name. He was one of the leaders of the peace walks through the minefields of Cambodia. He asked a question: why do you remember your suffering? Why don't you let it go? I have to admit, I was horrified. It seemed such an inappropriate thing to say on Yom HaShoah. The next day, they visited a Palestinian refugee camp. And after the director of the camp gave his talk, Maha again spoke up. Why do you remember your suffering? Why don't you let it go? Suddenly, when the question was directed at someone else, I could hear the question, and it made me think. So I'm going to back up a little bit. I came to Israel from England in the 1980s, full of enthusiasm for what the state of Israel might achieve, keen to be part of the rebirth of my nation. After some years as a lawyer and mediator, I came to see that the issue of Jewish-Arab relations, the question of how we're all meant to live together in this small, beautiful, troubled place, has to be addressed. For 15 years, I had had almost no contact with my Arab fellow citizens or with Palestinians over the Green Line. I didn't see them as enemies, but to be honest, I hardly saw them at all. In the year 2000, I left my work as a lawyer and mediator behind me and began working in the field of interreligious dialogue, pretty much by chance. My first few experiences of dialogue were a bit frustrating. I found it was difficult to move beyond intellectual debate and discussion of political issues. And I wondered whether a women's dialogue group might be different. So in October of that year, even as the second Intifada began to rage, I began meeting with a group of Jerusalem women. And the dialogue was indeed different. I saw that women come to dialogue, obviously this is a generalization, but on the whole, women come to dialogue to establish relationships rather than debate politics. And the dialogue finally reached the heart rather than stopping at the head. Throughout those challenging years, as the city exploded around us, we continued to meet, firstly in so-called neutral space, then in each other's homes, traveling to and fro between East and West Jerusalem, providing escorts when we didn't feel safe or we didn't know where we were going. It was an amazing experience, culminating in making a beautiful book of collages together that I have to this day. At the height of the Second Intifada, I was working on a project for religious leaders. Palestinian suicide bombers were part of our everyday lives. I was sitting with a psychologist we were working with, who he himself had been injured in a bomb attack in Jerusalem, and we were discussing the deteriorating relations between Jews and Arabs in Israel and Palestine. We talked about our growing concern over the hatred that was beginning to rear its head even then. Little did we know the heights that that hatred was going to reach. Yitzhak commented on the fact that victims of terror attacks receive counseling in order to help them return to normal functioning. Normal meaning they can go to work, they can run their homes, they can look after their children, a basic level of functioning in the world. But hatred was considered part of normality, because hating the people who've blown you up, that's normal, right? Hatred isn't something that needs counseling. So that conversation struck a deep chord, because if hatred is seen as normal, how are we going to overcome our trauma and learn to live together? Who's going to heal the hatred? I realized that if dialogue were going to have an impact, it needed to reach deeper than the head and deeper than the heart. We needed to create a dialogue of the soul if we were to heal from the trauma and move forward and find a way to live together. How can we refuse to be enemies with each other when we're surrounded by a discourse of hatred and suffer years and decades of violent conflict? So I tried various things. I tried text study, I tried conflict dialogue, I tried life story dialogue. Each person shares their life story, and then the group reflects together on their understandings of those stories. A Jewish woman in that group described the moment when a friend came running into their kibbutz room to call her newlywed husband to grab his stuff and come, as war had broken out on Yom Kippur. And the last time she saw him was as she lay in bed with the sheet pulled up to her chin, as the friend didn't think to leave the room to let them say goodbye. A Palestinian woman told her family's story, their roots in Ramla, her grandparents, her parents married as war broke out in 1948. They fled the very same day to escape the fighting. And she actually finished the story, her life story. She finished the story at the moment of her birth 9 months later. Her life story told the story of her people, of her parents, of her grandparents, nothing about her own life. I kept on working, looking for ways to deepen the dialogue. I heard that the Hebrew Union College was developing a course in spiritual counseling. Spiritual counseling at the time was very new in Israel. I wondered if there would be tools there that might help us. But it was too soon because the field was so new that they were still developing the language of spiritual care in the Jewish world and specifically in Israel. Then I spent a year in England and I did my MA in Peace and Reconciliation Studies. And it was a chance to sort of step back from the everyday work and take some time out to consider some academic perspectives. During that year, I came across the work of the famous Mennonite peacemaker, John Paul Lederach. I particularly recommend, he's got a very, very short piece you can find online called The Meeting Place, which is wonderful. I also heard of the Institute for the Healing of Memories in South Africa, founded by the Anglican priest, Father Michael Lapsley, who had lost his hands, hearing and the sight in one eye when he was sent a letter bomb in the last days of the apartheid regime. And he's done amazing work of healing and reconciliation ever since. And then in 2012, I met Sami Awad, who I believe some of you at least know, the founding director of the Holy Land Trust in Bethlehem, an organization dedicated to reconciliation and healing. And through traveling his own path, including a life-changing visit to Auschwitz, Sami had come to a very similar conclusion, believing that we had to find a way to heal societal trauma and change the discourse of our two societies. So finally, the pieces, everything came together, and Professor Ruhama Weiss from the Spiritual Care Program at HUC, Sami and I began experimenting with all sorts of different tools to see if we could come up with something new. And we did a whole series of pilot programs. For years, we would always say, okay, we're trying again. This is a new pilot. Using the spiritual care questionnaire that Ruhama had developed, mindfulness work, clinical psychologists, study of religious texts. We experimented with a whole load of different combinations and different elements. Finally, after, 6 years, in 2018, we finally felt that we had a model. And we conducted our first intensive facilitator training in Jordan, a place relatively easy to reach for both Palestinians and Israelis. Now, it's very difficult for me to explain exactly what it is that we do. I tend to tell people that it's a new method of interreligious dialogue, but it isn't exactly interreligious and it isn't really dialogue. We've taken the spiritual questionnaire that Ruhama developed, and we adapt it for each specific context that we work in. But we also use a special protocol that overcomes the common dynamic of competitive victimhood, which is so pervasive in dialogue in our region. So what we do is each person has to share a personal spiritual dilemma connected to the national conflict. I try and explain what I mean by that. I say to people, it's a question connected to the conflict that keeps you up at night, that you can't resolve for yourself. And having shared that dilemma with the group, they then reflect on a whole series of questions in the questionnaire about their lives, about foundational events, the groups they feel connected with, text, rituals, their fears, their hopes for the future. Rather than telling my story in order to change you, I share my story to give you insight which may help me. Because what happens after I've told my story is I sit back and the group reflect on my story within a strict set of rules, but they reflect on my story and they talk about me in the third person. I am not part of the conversation. I am outside listening. So I've shared my story in order to give you insight to help me. And rather than me listening to your story and thinking about how it impacts on me, I step out of my shoes and reflect your story back to you with insights about the connections between your story and your dilemma. And in listening to you from a place of spiritual connection and understanding, I call it active witnessing. My active witnessing helps to heal your pain. And in doing so, that connection also heals me. So along the way, there have been many helpful and painful moments. It's very difficult listening to stories and experiences that contradict our founding myths and our sense of morality. It's very painful. We hear stories of unspeakable suffering and abuse. And I return to our starting point and the question posed by that Buddhist monk. Why do we remember our suffering? Why can't we let it go? A few years ago, it was actually after a visit to Hiroshima, and I was reflecting on that key point in the Pesach Haggadah, when we are told that B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lirot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim. In every generation, we must each see ourselves as if we have come out of Egypt. So as always, there's great wisdom in our tradition. And I suddenly realized that we're not told to remember the suffering. We're told to see ourselves as those who have come out of slavery, as those who have been released from suffering, those who have escaped persecution, have survived to tell the tale. It's the redemptive moment we are asked to remember, not to dwell on the suffering in an obsessive way. So how can we take this lesson and apply it to our history of persecution, and in particular to the Shoah? How do we apply this to our history of violent conflict with the Palestinian people and our neighbor states? How do we rebuild relationships and learn to trust? Well, as I'm sure many of you know, the atmosphere and discourse in Israel-Palestine don't encourage people to trust each other. Our political leadership fans the flames of mistrust and hatred. I think that may resonate with some of you, not only here in Israel. And this week of all weeks, we've seen some of that play out in graphic detail. So here in Israel, I think there are three factors that complicate the lack of trust. And those are separation, fear, and ignorance. The three things that go together. Fear breeds ignorance and separation. Separation breeds ignorance and fear. And ignorance breeds fear and separation. And we just go round and round and round in that deeper and deeper into that vortex of mistrust. So those are the three factors that we're trying to reduce in our work at the Rossing Centre. We'll start with separation. In Israel-Palestine, as Hanan mentioned right at the beginning, we live very separate lives. Most Jewish Israelis never meet Palestinians. For many Palestinians in the West Bank, the only Israelis they come across are soldiers. And even within Israel itself, Arabs and Jews live separately. Our children go to separate schools. Even within Jewish society, there are separate streams for every nature of Jewish kid. I remember when my son was 6 years old and I wanted to sign him up for soccer camp in the summer holidays. And I called up the camp, and the first thing they asked me was, were we religious? There were separate streams for Orthodox and secular kids. It didn't matter what he was like at soccer. The question was about his religious observance. So even within Jewish society and even in the context of soccer camp, God forbid religious and secular kids should play soccer with each other. We live in separate neighborhoods, we shop at separate shops, even in a so-called mixed city like Jerusalem. A few years ago, we did a house swap for a holiday in France. And we left, you know, in our home, we left details of how to get to various places, where to shop, the usual stuff a tourist might need. I came home to find an Arab bus map on the table. I'd never seen one in my life. It showed the different routes of the Arab buses which pass the bottom of my street. They stop at the same stops as the Jewish buses. I'd never even registered them as a possible means of transport. No one in my family or my close friends, nobody had ever taken one of these Arab buses. It had literally never occurred to us. That's how separate our lives are. We live these parallel lives, even whilst we exist in the same space. So one of the things we do at the Rossing Centre is to tackle that separation. We have a schools program called Dialogue and Identity, where we twin Jewish and Arab schools. We work with 5th to 7th grade kids. This year, at the moment, we have 24 schools. We're due to increase that to 40 schools next year. The school principals meet each other. The teachers participate in a teacher training program that give them the tools and capacity to co-facilitate the pupil encounters. And the pupils learn about the 3 religions and then meet 4 or 5 times over the course of the year, getting to know each other, breaking down barriers of suspicion and ignorance. They're quite young, 5th to 7th grade, so they're like 10 to 12 years old. And so relatively quickly, they see that the others are kids like them, just they have some different traditions, different cultural practices, which makes it actually quite interesting to get to know them rather than a threat to be overcome. They learn to ask questions if they don't know something about the other person, instead of just making assumptions. My favorite line from one of the children was when one of the girls summed up her experience by saying, you can Google a festival, but you can't Google getting to know different people. This year, of course, they're meeting on Zoom. We've had to make all sorts of adaptations to the program, but I've actually been very pleasantly surprised to discover that not only does it work, but there are even some advantages to meeting in virtual space. Actually, tonight's meeting is an example of the advantages, because we could never meet in real space except with taking enormous lengths to travel to each other. Another program we just started this year, weird timing, is something called the Open House Project in Ramla. We've been given the use of a fabulous building in Ramla. It's a building with an amazing complex Jewish Arab-Jewish history. And we're going to be using that as a center for cooperation, partnership, to build real joint projects, to create real shared space in a mixed city. So that's separation. Now, what about ignorance? Ignorance, another big problem. The Israeli education system doesn't do very much to educate Jewish children about Christians and Muslims, let alone about Palestinians. It's a little bit better in the other direction, although we could argue about whether it's done in a positive or a negative way. Our work, we focus more on the interreligious than on the Israeli-Palestinian. Our work concentrates on overcoming ignorance about the three religions, both mainly through teacher training, tour guide training, courses, classes. We work with government ministries, we do work with the army, we do work with the tourism ministry, with all sorts of different ministries, educating about the three religions, both directly, indirectly, and in fact, even through our website. We have a Know Your Neighbor section on our website in 3 languages. And one of the things we've been particularly delighted to see is that we get quite a lot of traffic from the Arab world of people looking for material about Judaism in Arabic, and providing balanced, reasonable material about Judaism in Arabic is a niche which is sorely needed, because most of what you can find out there about Judaism in Arabic is not exactly unbiased. Let's put it that way. We also specialize, we have a particular specialization in education about Christianity. There are a whole load of reasons for that, but in order to learn more about that, you will have to register and come online next week when Hannah Bendikovsky, my colleague and friend, she is a fabulous speaker, will be speaking about more about that aspect of our work and about Jewish-Christian relations in the Holy Land in particular. And that's a whole fascinating sort of side piece of the interreligious work we do. So that's what we do about separation and ignorance. Let's come back to fear. Fear is all pervasive in this conflict. Fear from the day-to-day level to the existential fear for national survival. Jewish fear, we all know well, you know, it's based in our long history of persecution, culminating in the systematic destruction of the Shoah, and followed by so many years of ongoing violent conflict in Israel-Palestine. It's left us traumatized, it's left us obsessed by security, and with the conviction that security is purely a military question, and one that can only be met by military might. On the Palestinian side, they've also been traumatized by the experiences of dispossession and expulsion, years of violent oppression, lack of control over their own lives and society. They've all created a brutalized and traumatized people. On both sides, even those who want to make peace seem to be driven by fear and trauma and justify separation as a way to ensure security. So I've already talked about our Healing Hatred program. We have another program addressing the fear we have of tackling conflictual issues within each society, even within each society, let alone between the two. That program trains high school teachers to examine their own prejudices in order to empathize with their pupils' fear and frustration, and enable them to process those emotions and develop more nuanced ways of dealing with conflict, and develop a culture of discourse which is more respectful of other points of view. It seems that that's something that we need all over the world. Our culture of discourse has deteriorated drastically. And of course, we have to challenge the leadership on both sides, which prefers to manipulate our fear and base instincts in order to maintain control and power. We have to ask ourselves whose interests it serves for us to hate each other and refuse to give in to those instincts. So before I finish this frontal part of my presentation, I want to say something about a theological dimension of refusing to be enemies. I'll begin by quoting Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of the greatest Jewish thinkers and activists of the 20th century. So Heschel wrote, "Religion is critique of all satisfaction. Its end is joy, but its beginning is discontent, detesting boasts, smashing idols. It began in Ur Kasdim, in the seat of a magnificent civilization. Yet Abraham said no, breaking the idols, breaking away. And so every one of us must begin saying no to all visible, definable entities pretending to be triumphant, ultimate." Heschel saw an act of refusal at the heart of the Jewish narrative. Abraham says yes to God, but that yes is forged in a no, a refusal to go along with the idols of his day. Heschel believed that in every generation, it is our responsibility to identify the idols which have a hold on us, pretending to be ultimate. There are many such contemporary idols, of course, but in Israel and Palestine today, one of the most persistent idols is the belief that it is our fate to hate each other, that Israelis and Palestinians, Jews, Christians, Muslims must live perpetually as enemies. To be true to the finest of our traditions is to refuse to be paralyzed or infatuated by the narrative of enmity. As Heschel taught, every one of us must begin by saying no. For Abraham, the idols were made of wood and clay, but in our day we have a harder challenge to say no to separation, no to fear, no to ignorance of the other. Our traditions begin in a sacred act of refusal, and this is our current imperative, to refuse to hate despite all the challenges and without pretending that everything is simple or beautiful. If we do this together, we may yet find a way, messy, difficult, distant though it may be, to come together and say yes. For me, that has become the core of my religious belief, the commitment to seek peace and pursue it. Thank you. That's the end of my formal presentation, and I'm delighted to now be able to open it up to conversation and dialogue. I run a dialogue organization, so let's begin a dialogue.
Yeah, so it's always slow at the beginning. The first question is always the hardest. So people can just unmute themselves and speak up. Later when it will get more bubbly, perhaps we'll have to moderate it more. Anyone want to go first?
I would like to ask a question. If I might.
And Andrew, and then perhaps afterwards, Alison.
Yeah, so the presentation was fascinating and really interesting, and I appreciate the various details of what you shared. The impression I had, which may not be accurate, is that the dialogue and the I guess the reflective listening and so forth, that it occurred mainly between Jewish Israelis and Palestinians living within Israel, or Palestinian citizens of Israel, maybe Jerusalem. I know that you've worked a lot with Sami Awad and someone else from Hebrew Union College, and I'm wondering, do you have participation from Palestinians in Bethlehem or elsewhere in the occupied territories as well? And if you do, do you see differences between working with them and working with Israeli Palestinians, or is there a lot of commonalities there?
Certainly our Healing Hatred program is actually the one that we have been doing cross-border. Most of the rest of our work is within Israel itself, but Healing Hatred we've been doing with Palestinians in the West Bank. We've actually done it in all sorts of different forms. We've done Israelis and Palestinians from the West Bank, Israelis, Jewish Israelis, Arabs from within Israel, and Palestinians from the West Bank, just within Israeli society, just within Palestinian society, between Muslims and Christians, between different political factions. We did some work at a university in the West Bank. I won't mention which because it was sort of confidential, but at a West Bank university between Palestinian students from the West Bank and Palestinian students from Israel, because there was tension between those two groups. So we've used it in a lot of different contexts, also within Jerusalem itself. There are absolutely differences between Palestinians in the West Bank and Palestinians within Israel, particularly in terms of their direct experiences of violence. The stories from the West Bank are really very difficult to listen to and heart-wrenching, and they live with a whole different level of struggle in terms of their everyday lives.
Thank you, Sarah. Alison, did you want to say something? Alison Curry, or are we just shielding your eyes?
I'm unmuting. Hi, how are you?
Hello.
It's so great to be here. I've heard so much and seen so much of the wonderful work that you're doing. I'm friends with and work with Saskia, and this talk was so beautiful, and I loved your dedication to learn about this and pioneer. My question is, that you were reading and citing about codes that have been handed down from so long ago, and Saskia and I were talking about the law today and how we try to fit into the Constitution and codes that we've inherited, and we have both a reverence and a deference to these documents, and it's all a matter of interpretation. And how do we really move forward when we're tied to things that obviously haven't worked for us yet?
Well, I think I think that is indeed one of our major challenges, is to work out how to make sense of our religious traditions in a way that does not foster hatred and division. Our religious texts and traditions are open to so many different interpretations that's our rabbis have been wrestling with texts, and religious leaders through the generations have been wrestling with texts. And the question is, how do we foster interpretations of those texts and understandings of those texts which help us to live together? For me, it's inconceivable. For me, it really has become, as I said, a core religious belief that if we can't live together without killing each other, does any of the rest of it really matter? It's like, it seems to me that all the ritual aspects of our religious lives, people observe them to different degrees and understand them differently. But if we can't even stop killing each other, how much can it matter whether I wait 1 hour or 3 hours between eating meat and milk? It's like, to me, that's where we've got to start. So we've got to interpret our religious texts in line with the idea that God cannot possibly be that we are put on this earth to kill each other, and that fundamental understanding of everybody being created in the image of God is just the fundamental understanding that we have to interpret everything else in light of that understanding.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm looking at the questions in the chat, and I see that Robin asked the question, Robin Friedman. The question is, how do you get students to participate? I don't know if Robin, do you want to add to that, or should I just leave it at that? How do you get students to participate?
So our schools program, one of the reasons that we work in schools is that we don't just want to work with those who are already on our team, as it were, on those who are already keen to dialogue. We want to reach people who are not particularly interested in dialogue. And therefore, if we work with schools and make it part of the formal education system, then everybody has to participate. In theory, parents, well, in practice, parents have to sign a permission slip for their kids to participate, because the program takes the kids to visit each other's schools. So they have to have parental agreement. But in practice, even if parents aren't very keen, on the whole, they'll sign the piece of paper and let their kids participate, because otherwise their kid gets left behind. You know, you don't want your kid to be left behind when all the rest of the class are going off to visit another school. So on the whole, we get 100% participation. And the good news is we have to recruit the schools rather than the individual kids. And we actually have, on the whole, we tend to have schools signed up on a waiting list, waiting to join the program. So recruitment isn't such a problem for us. And by the end of the year, most of the parents are completely won over. And where at the beginning of the year, we'll have a few parents who come along to escort the kids. By the end of the year, we have lots of parents coming along to escort the kids because they don't want to be left out.
Thank you. George Douglas would like to ask a question. I'll just mention George is a member of the board of American Friends of Roots. George.
Sure, and thanks. I'd like to pass something along, get your reaction to it, because it's a little bit of a different direction on this subject than what's generally been talked about. I've got some very good friends that are survivors of the Rwanda genocide. And the bulk of their family members were killed, their friends were killed. They narrowly escaped themselves. And they live in the United States now. They're very passionate supporters of peace in Rwanda. And when I've asked them why, their answer was kind of interesting. And again, I'd like to get your reaction to it. What they told me was that they don't forgive the people that murdered their family, many of whom are already out of prison in terms of the militia members. They don't forgive them. They don't believe they got justice. But they put as a priority the future of the people that weren't even born in Rwanda at the time of the genocide above their narrative. That's their priority. And they're willing to set aside what happened to them for that. And have you encountered that attitude also?
I can say that, look, when it comes to the Shoah, talk of it, it feels impossible to me to talk of forgiveness and the Shoah in one breath. We once, in one of our pilot courses of Healing Hatred, we had a meeting which it turned out, a day meeting which turned out to fall on Yom HaShoah. And we debated what we would do with that day. And actually, Sami suggested we do a day on forgiveness. And I said, we can't. You know, we can't. We can't do a day on forgiveness on Yom HaShoah. But I said, I think what we can do is we can do a day on healing. Because healing and forgiveness are not the same thing. It's difficult to precisely define what healing means when it comes to the Shoah, as opposed to forgiveness. I think healing is, we can heal ourselves, and it's not necessarily to do with our relationship with the perpetrator. So I don't think that I've come across people who say, I've certainly come across people, particularly families of people killed in the conflict, in whether through terror attacks or soldiers or whatever, who have said that that it's again, I think on the whole, Jews and the talk about forgiveness of the perpetrator doesn't come easily, but who can certainly talk about creating a better future together, not only for coming generations, but even for their own generation, who can understand that whilst not necessarily forgiving the person who perpetrated this terrible act, they can see a way that we have to move forward and learn to live with each other. So I do think that that's a possible and not infrequent response. I will mention that my family are British going back generations, but my husband's family are survivors, and so the Shoah narrative is very much part of my family's story. And as I say, I don't think we can talk about forgiveness, but I do think we can talk about healing. And I think we have to talk about healing. I think there's something in the way that we remember that is re-traumatizes us rather than helping us heal. And we have to find a way to remember in a way that does not deepen the trauma and traumatize, generation after generation, rather than healing us as a people. And I don't know how we heal as a people. I don't know how we do that, on a national level, on a collective level, but we have to find a way to do it.
Sarah, I'm going to add a comment to what you just said in reference to what George asked. I just want to add that putting aside our hatred for the good of future generations is based on the assumption that putting aside that hatred is good for future generations. But in our conflict, at least among Israeli Jews, there's a deep sense that putting aside that hatred is not good for future generations. It's not good. What's good for future generations is to maintain the distrust of the other, because if we let our guard down, they're going to kill us.
And there speaks the trauma.
Exactly.
Hence
Exactly.
the need for healing.
Yeah. So Alan in the chat said he would like to ask something, and I welcome you to speak up, Alan.
Hello, may I call you Sarah, or I can also
Please
call you
do.
Dr. Okay, hi,
Please
Sarah.
do. Hi, Alan.
I enjoyed your talk. I appreciate it very much. And I appreciated also that your description of trying various pilot programs before you found something that you felt worked. That's great. And I'm interested in knowing, how do you evaluate that it's working? Well, how do you evaluate we found something and this works?
Well, we have used both anecdotal, our own understanding of what is happening in the groups, as well as external evaluation. To my mind, I'm not sure I've ever been all that happy with the external evaluation, in the sense that my experience is that in many cases of dialogue, even dialogue which doesn't seem to me to be all that significant or successful, when you ask the participants, they will report at least a certain degree of success, because they have met each other, they have listened to each other, they've heard something, etc., etc. once we had this, once we developed what we felt was a good model, we started trying it out. We did a whole bunch of short, sharp shock seminars, as it were, intensive weekend seminars where we would get through a whole group in the course of one weekend. And we had one weekend where well, actually, no, in some of those weekends, we had participants who were experienced dialogue facilitators themselves. And we then got our evaluator to interview the experienced dialogue facilitators to try and understand what was different and why it was working so well. And we've had across the board, we've had people self-report, and we can see in the way that people maintain their connections afterwards. We can see the depth of the experience. We even had, when we're doing this cross-border, then we do it with translation. And the translators we have two fabulous translators who we work with and who have translated, hundreds of dialogue meetings. And they were so taken with what they saw in our program that they actually came and joined as participants at one point because it was so clear to them that this was something else and this was something different. So we have many measures of the fact that it really works on some level. But of course, it's terribly difficult to quantify that. And as my CV says, I have experience in interreligious dialogue evaluation, and I'm actually now part of an international think tank looking at that again, and trying to come up with some sort of standardized measure of the success of interreligious dialogue. But it's very difficult to evaluate.
Thank you.
I see Ava had her hand up for quite a while. So please speak.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bernstein. I really appreciate your time and all the work you do. I want to preface my question by saying that I have a deep belief in interreligious work, and really I do believe in it. That being said, within my own Judaism and Jewish spaces here in Israel, I feel there's a theological inconsistency between, everyone's made in B'Tselem Elohim, yet in the West Bank, there are, still housing demolitions that are going on in the South Hebron Hills in order to clear space for the IDF. And that's an ongoing to this day, phenomenon that's affecting Palestinians. So I wonder, how does interreligious dialogue, how is there, I guess, the spiritual resource for interreligious dialogue for Palestinians where they're being physically and spiritually in every which way told that they are not wanted, they are not welcome in their home, and that they actually need to leave?
I think that's a fabulous question. Thank you for asking it. One of the questions, I mentioned Michael Lapsley, the Anglican priest from South Africa, who was himself blown up by a letter bomb and has been working ever since in this Institute of Healing Memories. And one of the things I asked here, I was lucky enough to I actually met him twice. I was in South Africa and went and spoke with his staff. And then he came to Israel at our invitation and took part in a conference here. And one of the things I asked him was whether we can do this sort of work whilst the conflict is ongoing. You know, can we talk about healing hatred whilst we're still killing each other? And the answer I came to, and I guess he came to too, was no and yes. Because no, because it's impossible, and yes, because there's no alternative. Because how are we to change the situation if we don't do this work? One of my most pressing questions is, for years I've been trying to work out, how do we do dialogue in a way that creates real impact? I know it creates impact on the people who participate in the dialogue, but how do, we can't do this at scale. I can't do this with, I don't know, however many million people we now have living in this region. So how do we create change? That's something I'm still struggling with. I found a method that works, but I don't know how to do it to scale. One of the approaches is to get people to move from dialogue into action, into getting out there and doing something about the injustice and the inequality and the stuff going on. And it's hard. It's particularly hard because, well, I think there are all sorts of things that are hard about it. Part of me wonders whether whether there are two types of people in the world, people who like to talk and people who like to do. And it's quite difficult to get people to become, to move from one to the other. It's also, Israelis come to dialogue and they feel that they have taken action by coming to dialogue. And it's hard to get them to understand that, no, coming to dialogue was just the step that you took to understand that now you need to go out there and do something about it. It's hard getting people to go out there and do something about it. We're now using our healing hatred methodology as a sort of kickstart seminar for task forces to tackle particular issues. But it's very hard for the Palestinians who take part in that program. I think they find it significant to have Israelis listen and understand and, undergo some transformative experience, particularly if those Israelis then go out and do something about it. But it's, and there's something, because of the way the methodology works, there's something healing about having their pain and suffering witnessed in that way. And it is a very active and affirming witnessing process. But it's I wish I knew how to get people out on the streets doing more.
Thank you, Sarah. We have a question now.
I know there are lots of questions in the chat. I just can't talk and read and listen all at the same time, so my apologies.
No problem at all. We have a question from Saskia Keeley, who's also a member of the board of the American Friends of Roots. Saskia writes, beyond the personal transformation of the participants in the Healing Hatred programs, can you tell us more about how the participants use the work and dialogue that was done in the larger communities? That's really related to what you were just talking about.
Yes, it is. So we some of them go back and get involved in different activist programs. And now, as I say, we're using it to sort of kickstart task forces who will be working on different issues. One of the things that's come out in a lot of those groups is questions of sexual abuse, which doesn't often come out in dialogue programs, but that has come up a lot. So we're going to be using it as to put together task forces to tackle gender violence in both societies. Yeah, we're trying.
Sarah, sorry. Yes, the question was answered just before my question was put up. Another quick question for you is, who are the participants, outside of the dialogue facilitator that are coming to the workshop? Who are they? And the next question is, because that's a question that's always asked by my workshops in the West Bank when I have both sides meet, is when you said at one point that connections do remain afterwards. How do those connections remain as it is so difficult for the people on the two sides to meet, in a given place? So when you say connections remain, how is that through social media? Are they meeting? I mean, just if you can expand a little bit on these two questions.
Mm-hmm. So the participants, it depends on who. I hate it when the Zoom screens move around and suddenly I was looking at Saskia and you've gone. Anyway, so we were, our participants are a whole variety of people depending on the particular groups that we're working with. Some of them we open up to the general public and whoever wants can come. Sometimes we work with a specific group. So we'll be working, we're doing some work with teachers, we're doing some work with students, we're doing some work with various different, when we're putting together task forces, then we bring together a group of people who want to work around a particular issue and then do the work with them. In terms of how they keep in touch, so they keep in touch on, well, in today's world where suddenly we've all just realized that we can actually keep in better touch with each other than we realized and that we don't have to physically meet. So I think there's a lot more of people meeting up on, people keep in touch on WhatsApp and whatever, but they also, they call, they Zoom, they find various channels of communication. In the old days, they used to also meet each other. And there was quite a lot of visiting each other, even when it wasn't theoretically, meant to be taking place. I don't mean because of COVID, I mean because of Israel-Palestine regulations about where you're allowed to go and where you're not allowed to go. So using a whole variety of channels and asking us to organize, more meetings and to reconnect them again and get together and reunions and all sorts of different things.
Thank you.
Colleen would like to ask a question. Colleen, you could unmute yourself.
Hi, Sarah. I truly appreciate your recognition of the desire, perhaps, and the need to move toward a more soulful dialogue, something even deeper than a psychological dialogue or a personal dialogue. What I found, including from learning from time working in the West Bank, was there were ways of weaving together the very deep, sacred intrapersonal work with the relational bonds, with global, national, global healing. The term that I've used is the soul sensibilities, and I'm wondering, in your work, two things. When you do these group meets and you have somebody witness and then they share and the person that's being talked about listens, if that would be the best way to foster the deep bondedness that you're seeking, and also if in taking that to a global level, if you could focus on issues that are both deeply felt personally and globally. It's about power, pain, vulnerability, needing one another, authority, that when we talk about these large existential and personal issues, people then can take them away and personally, collectively, nationally work with them in ways that do move forward a very deep bondedness. They found that with the ISIS workers in the Middle East, that what brought them to talk with others was that they could belong together. So this is very deep work. It's got to do with, yes, releasing old attachments, old traumas, but that's pretty deep work, and it would take, yes, as you said, all the time. But I would like to encourage you that what you're doing, there are ways to bring that to a very cultural, national level, and that it might start with those little moments you have in your groups where people let people know that they are seen as a sacred being.
So I'm not quite sure if I'm understanding what you're saying as in terms of bringing it to the cultural national level, whether you mean in terms of the conversation that that small group is having, touching on cultural national issues, or whether you mean impacting on the cultural national level.
Well, if you use some of those soul dilemmas, issues, sensibilities that are shared amongst everyone. So if it is when I face my own inner struggle, I struggle with the issue of power and how to be vulnerable with my pain. Then also when you're dealing with cultural pain, it's more than just a story, a narrative. It's about what am I going to do with the power I have? How will I use it? Whether it's in an intimate moment with one person, with myself, with my nation, that there are sensibilities, and these are being measured through appreciative inquiry, phenomenology, and probably as you were already talking about in your group. So
I think that resonates very strongly with what we do, because we ask people to connect with a spiritual dilemma they have that is connected to the national conflict. That is very much that level. So we do indeed go back and forth between the deeply personal, but also the national, the cultural, the collective picture, story, dilemma, power, all those things that you mentioned. So I think that is indeed part of the importance of the work is that we connect those different levels.
so when you're in your, I'm sorry, so when you're in your groups, what is your thinking around having the two witnesses speak and the previous talker?
No, what happens is each person in the group, we tend to do this in groups of 8. We can't do it in groups of 16 is an ideal size for a dialogue group, but you can't get through 16 spiritual questionnaires. It's just too much. We divide into 2 groups of 8, and then each person in that group of 8 gets the chance to share their spiritual questionnaire, and the rest of the time they are being the active witnesses for the other 7 people's questionnaires. So we go through a cycle where everybody gets a chance to share their story and their questionnaire, and everybody is actively witnessing the other questionnaires. And through that you hear many different stories, as well as sharing your own, and you do that healing work, and it creates incredibly strong bonds. It creates, really incredibly strong bonds between people to share on that level, to support each other on that level, to understand each other on that level is incredibly powerful.
Okay, let's try and get in a few more questions. Beth and Peter from Boulder, Colorado mentioned that their city of Boulder is twinned with Nablus and Ramat HaNegev. They asked, do you have participants in either Nablus or Ramat HaNegev?
We've had 2 participants from Nablus. Actually, no, by now I think that's 3. Yeah, they were terrific. We had a couple of, we had 3 relatively young people, but 2 of them were psychologists from Nablus, and we were delighted to have them with us. And I will even, I even admit that I went to visit them as well.
I would love to find some way to connect with them if there's a way you could give us that information or share that.
Well, I would have to check with them first, of course.
Okay.
But if you get in touch with me afterwards, Hanan can connect us, then
Okay.
Then I will ask.
Thank you.
We have a question from Margot. Can you explain the difference between interfaith and interreligious in terms of encouraging dialogue? You had started with the great divisions in Israeli society. So does one thing, interfaith or interreligious, come first, or at the same time? Is there a group that is harder to reach or lower numbers in participation?
Okay, that's a great question, Margot. I'm sorry to have to tell you that I wrote a whole MA paper on the difference between interfaith and interreligious. So we're going to have to change. We're going to have to save that for another time, because I do have a whole theory about different modes of dialogue between people of different faiths. In a nutshell, I use interfaith. On the whole, I use interfaith to refer to theological dialogue at a leadership level, and I talk about interreligious work as work in building relations between members of different faith communities. But that's, a very quick distinction I try and make. What was the question? Is there a group that is harder to reach? Well, we in the work that we do, we successfully reach Arabs, Jews, secular Orthodox. We have yet to have significant reach or almost any reach in the Haredi, in the ultra-Orthodox community. We did almost do one of our high school programs in an ultra-Orthodox school, but it fell through. So that will be the day if we ever make it into those circles. That's a real challenge.
So our plan of action has been to end at this time, 15 minutes before the hour, but to allow those who want to stay in a more intimate conversation to converse with the speaker, with Sarah. So that's what we'll do. I'll tell all of you, thank you very much for joining us. And of course, Sarah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll mention, Sarah mentioned that her colleague, Hannah, will be talking next week. What exactly, remind me again, Sarah, what's the subject for next week with Hannah?
It's something to do with Jewish-Christian relations in the Holy Land. People often forget that there's a Palestinian Christian community here. So to be talking about that.
Thank you. So again, those of you who are able to visit the Roots website, please do so. If you're able to donate, we encourage you. Our website is friendsofroots.net, friendsofroots.net. So I'm gonna just go on now with the questions.
And I just mentioned that anybody who wants to be in touch with me, you can do so through our Rossing Center for Education and Dialogue website, or I'm sure Hanan will be good enough to put us in touch if you'd like to contact me.
Great. So we were dealing with a question from, let's see, who was that? Margot. Margot has another question, a continued question. What are some of the programs for different age groups? Children, students, adults, professionals, other communities, as far as length of time, minimum to maximum. Margaret, do you want to explain exactly what you're getting at there?
I just wanted an overview of the programs. I know that Dr. Bernstein has already addressed some of my question. And so I've been inferring some of the parts from that, but it's not clear to me. Especially what I did catch was that you seem to have weekend intensives for adults to dialogue, and it seems like you do approach various specialized communities, whether they are professionals or people who live in a certain place or whatever. But it seems like, and my inferences might have been incorrect, that you start with young children and go through to adults. And I don't know whether some things are just a one-off meeting for an afternoon or whether some programs extend through a whole, let's say, school term.
Yeah,
or
so we
season.
Indeed, we have a whole range adapted for different ages. We do a lot of our work within the formal education system as part of our strategy to achieve maximum impact. And much of that work focuses on training teachers rather than working with the kids ourselves, because we believe that, again, that way we can have more we can create more sustainable change. But we do indeed work with different groups. Sometimes, you know, if we can only get in to give an hour and a half lecture, then we'll give an hour and a half lecture. But if we can do a year-long course, we'll do a year-long course. So we have a wide variety of different programs adapted for our different target audiences.
There's a question from Avram Havivi. Is there a plan to follow up with the middle schoolers once they're closer to the age of activism or army?
So we work with the kids in 5th to 7th grade, partly because that's a key stage in identity formation, and we want them to have an experience of meeting the other before their identity really fossilizes. We actually tried doing a version of that program in high schools, and it didn't work. And our assessment was partly that's because if kids have never met each other by the time they get to high school, then the hostility is already pretty deeply embedded, and it's a much harder task to overcome that. And that unless teachers have the tools to conduct conflictual conversations in the classroom and contain the emotional, conduct the emotional work that needs to be done with the students to process those meetings before and after, then we're not convinced that there's much point in the actual meetings. Built into our schools program is the work that the teachers do with their students before and after each meeting, because you have to do the emotional processing. The meeting itself can sometimes stir up all sorts of emotions, and if you don't give the kids space to process that, you can do harm as well as good, and that's particularly true in middle and high school. So we, at that level, we concentrate on giving the teachers the tools to do that work with the students. And what we found is the schools that we work in that program, we tend to work with 20 teachers in one school. And once they finish our program, they often then bring the schools together and conduct meetings, but the teachers are much better equipped to contain the emotional work that needs to be done as a result of that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. David Hepler has a question in the chat box. I'm going to read it. Do you have any key people who could be thought of as points of light in various towns and cities such as Ramallah, Nablus, Jericho, Hebron, Rahat, where your programs can be conducted for people in those communities that have an interest in your spiritual healing activities?
So as I've mentioned, we do have people, most of our Palestinian participants have been, we have from Bethlehem, from Ramallah, from Nablus. I can't remember if I think we've had a couple of people from Jericho, a couple of people from Ramallah. Some of them definitely go on to use our methodology and use some of the tools within their own communities. It's hard. It's also particularly hard for Palestinians, if it's not something they can apply in their professional lives. It's a lot of them are really struggling to survive. So it's hard for them to take on extra things on top of just trying to get through the day, the week, the month, the year. But some of them have certainly taken our tools and used them. I know that one of the young women in Hebron has done quite a lot of work with young women in Hebron. So we definitely have some stories where people are using it, and please God, there will be more.
Thank you. That's encouraging to hear.
Sarah, would you be willing to put your email in the chat?
Yeah, of course.
And as soon as after you do that, I'll ask you the last question. There's a question here that's a good one to end with.
Hang on, I'm just trying to get my chat back to my screen. Where is my chat gone? Don't know how to.
If you can't find it, I can do it. If you just
here we go. No, here we go. I've got it. Just need to now do everyone. Send to everyone. There we go. Okay, there you go.
Very good. Thank you. Here's the last question from Andrew Spicer. It's a perfect way to end. On a personal level in daily life, how can Jews in Israel bridge the gaps between themselves and Arabs and Palestinians? What are things they can do to bring the groups together?
Oh, that's a good question too. It's so hard for it's very hard for Israelis and Palestinians to meet each other. They don't know each other. If they met each other, then I would say start talking to each other. But they don't really come across each other. Most of my friends in Jerusalem, they don't know Palestinians. They don't have anybody to talk to, which is why it's so important to create the spaces where people can meet. So I guess what I would say is, reach out, join an organization, take the chance to meet. Get out there and do something about it, because the situation is pretty bad, and we all need to step up and get involved. And for Palestinians, I think it's particularly challenging because they've got they're a bit disillusioned with dialogue. It hasn't done much for them over the years. So I wouldn't. It's not my place to suggest to them what they should do. But I think we Israelis have to get involved. We have to listen. We have to get active, and we have to work to change this.
Thank you so much. And I'm actually learning Arabic to try to bring the groups together. My Hebrew is fairly good, but I'm working on Arabic now.
Excellent. I have tried and failed, but
I'm a linguist, so I like it a lot.
Good.
Andrew, I was just about to suggest to you to learn Arabic.
Yeah.
So you're already there. Do you know?
That will make a huge difference.
Yeah.
Are you
the language gap? If people can understand each other's languages, it brings them closer.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Are you in Jerusalem or someplace else?
Modi'in.
I see.
Okay, not far.
Right.
Yeah.
It's in Jerusalem. You have the YMCA that has tremendous interfaith and intercommunal programs to meet the other side.
Oh, wow, look into that.
Yeah, IMCA, YMCA. You also have an organization called Tiyul Richle. Richle, I think, is Tiyul in Arabic, and they do joint hikes of Israelis and Palestinians. There's usually 20 to 30 people that sign up for each hike, and that brings the two sides together. There's also the Interfaith Encounter Association. You can look them up on the internet and find if there's a group in Modin. If there's not a group in Modin, you can create one.
Can you write these in the chat? These sound really cool.
And feel welcome to get in touch with us, and then you'll hear about any groups that we have opening up.
Oh, definitely, I will. Thank you. Your presentation was very nice. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So thank you, everyone. And please join us next week at the same time for Sarah's associate, Hannah Benkovsky, for Israeli and Jewish Christian dialogue, old problems, and new challenges. Thank you.
And she really is terrific. So so do join.
Yeah, I look forward to it next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Thanks a lot. It was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Hanan, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Shalom, good to see you.
How you doing?
Yeah, we're doing good. We're hanging in. It became winter in South Florida today. So,
wow. Well, what does winter mean?
Oh, that it's beautiful out, but you need a shirt of some sort, and you have to put the heat on. During the day. So, but it'll go away, and we'll be back to summer in a few days. So
it's actually summer here.
Is it really warm?
We've had a week and a half of unseasonably warm weather.
Okay, take it in stride. So yeah.